We say hello to New York then. Um, just a quick introduction, and then the floor is yours. Pablo Helguera, born in Mexico City, 1971, is a New York-based artist and educator whose work span installation, performance, pedagogy, and socially engaged art. Known for the School of Pan American Unrest, he has exhibited internationally, received major awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, and currently he teaches at the New School in New York. Helguera combines art with educational formats such as workshops, lectures, experimental schools, etc. And he is considered one of the most important theorists and practitioners of the education as art movement. He has published dozens of books, including Education for Socially Engaged Art from 2011, which is a standard work on art focused on social interaction. Pablo often works with humor, fiction, and performative strategies. For example, his Arttoons series, that's satirical art cartoons, or in performance lecture. He also has an extensive institutional practice. Pablo worked for many years in major US museums, including the MoMA and the Guggenheim, where he developed programs at the intersection of art education, audience engagement, and participation. I met Pablo first over 10 years ago in New York for an interview I did for the Method of Arts. And we stayed in touch ever since. Later, he came once to Zurich as an artist of Manifesta, and then last spring we met again in New York. And then when he recently posted, not without pride, his new record of tracked numbers of steps per day on his social media account, it was clear to me this is our man for our walking symposium. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here with us in Tenna and online. People also watching online.
Thank you so much, Johannes. I'm very grateful for being with you today and for being part of this conference. As Johannes has mentioned before, I come to you as a fellow walker. I sometimes, during these presentations, I share more of my, I guess, professional profile, where I studied the museums that I worked at, some of which Johannes already mentioned. But in this case, this is really what has conformed part of my life as both as an artist and as a person. And as a result, that has generated in me a lot of reflections and that I will share with you tonight. I started walking, or as the writer Laurie Waxman calls it, walking intently, sometime around 2020, which was of course, the time of the global pandemic, a time where, as you all know, we were found ourselves in a sudden lockdown, which for the art world meant that everybody had to stay at home and refrain from moving internationally, as is common of both the academic and the art market, to the various biennials and art fairs that everybody goes to usually. So we were forced to reimagine what movement for exploration could be within the confines of our own house. And I always enjoyed these tourist posters designed by American designer Jane Baer, kind of paradising the absurdity of us being in lockdown in an apartment and trying to like use for touristic desires or fulfill them by visiting our kitchen and our bathroom in our house. We also, during that period, I was reminded a lot of this movie by Luis Buñuel, the famous Spanish filmmaker, titled The Exterminating Angel. It's a movie made in 1962 that takes place in Mexico City in the house of this aristocratic family, or this house where everybody's having this beautiful party, and suddenly nobody can leave the house for mysterious and unknowable circumstances. So the party starts falling apart and becomes kind of like a disaster, and the true humanity and nastiness of everybody in the party starts becoming clear. So it was the pandemic was a time where confinement really tested or the structures of our society. I also got COVID during that time, and I was very, very sick during that time. Um, it it forced us to radically limit our mobility to our most immediate surroundings. During that time, my mind reverted to my childhood in Mexico when I was not allowed to leave the house unattended when I was very young as a kid, and I was dependent of an adult to go even beyond a few blocks. In New York, restaurants and stores were closed. Even some public parks were closed. No public transportation was available. And for many of us, New Yorkers who do not have a car, the only way to rebel against that type of imprisonment was to go for a walk through our neighborhoods. The activity became a form of exercise, but also an attempt to improve our mental health. And I wrote around the time in a text titled Radical Domesticity the following quote: "We have no choice but to rethink locality, to engage with our immediate domestic lives, with our own microhistories, with the world that is only a walking distance from where we are confined, and have those as a point of departure." So over the next 5 years, I've been increasing this practice of walking, and I have come to realize a few things about it, which I would like to summarize here in three main ideas. First, that movement and knowledge are intricately related, that the physical act of going towards something provides a concrete form of knowledge. Second, that art is a pilgrimage towards something, but that pilgrimage is also an art unto itself. And third, which perhaps goes without saying, and you all know it already, is that getting lost is underrated, as I will explain later. Um, I take my title of this presentation from the book, wonderful book by Mi-Won Kwon, a Korean art historian based in Los Angeles, who in the late 90s published this book, One Place After Another, in which she gave us a crucial framework to understand the transformation of site-specific art. By tracing how artworks move from physical locations to networks and social relations, one established a vocabulary that still underpins our understanding of a lot of things that we use now in what we call social practice. I would like to propose that now we require a similar conceptual framework to cement our theoretical understanding of walking as art. If Kwon helped us think about how art relates to place, now we need to ask about how art really relates to movement itself, to displacement, to encounters, to the embodied act of walking. So this small presentation tries to explore a little bit of that shift, the place as the grounding of artistic practice, to the trajectory, the path, and the encounter as the very substance of art. Many of which has been articulated much better than others, but I am trying to do more of a kind of like an analysis of what we know, what we have, what we're thinking about. But first, to talk about a little bit about movement as knowledge. To survive as human beings requires the ability to move. Our earliest ancestors, 300,000 years ago, depended on hunting and gathering. Immediately, we can understand that this process of gathering is in itself a form of learning, whether it's a nomadic or a sedentary community. The hunter-gatherer requires knowledge of the landscape, the ecological systems, the resources of their environment. What they observe must be shared and transmitted to their community, making this process of gathering an eminently social act. Movement also connects us to another kind of knowledge, which is the spiritual knowledge, the knowledge of the pilgrim. As it is well known, the principal reason that pilgrims walk the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain is spiritual, since the lessons gained suggest that difficulties and setbacks must be confronted rather than avoided. And of course, there's a million examples of pilgrimages around the world. The one that I'm most familiar with concerns the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City, where around 10 to 20 to 12 million people every year visited. Many people making these vows to the Virgin if she concedes certain things to them, that they will kneel for miles and walk toward the basilica to pay tribute and to thank the Virgin for her favors. So this, of course, is very important, right? But pilgrimage is not only necessarily an act of spiritual realization, it's also an act of the pursuit of knowledge. This is manifested, I think, best in, at least in the Baroque period, in the poetry of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. If you have never heard of her, she is perhaps the most important poet of the colonial period in the Americas, for sure, and one of the greatest poets of the Spanish language in the Baroque period. Sor Juana was born in Mexico City and raised in Mexico City. She was exceptionally intelligent, and she becomes a nun very young in the Convento de San Jerónimo in Mexico City, where she remains for the rest of her life. So she never really traveled outside of the New Spain. But however, she was always avid for knowledge, and her masterpiece, her most best known poem, is also one of the most difficult poems in the Spanish language. It's called Primero Sueño, First Dream. It's really heavily Latin with Baroque symbolism and Hermetic imagery. But it's essentially a poem about a quest of knowledge, a journey towards knowledge. She, in the poem, describes falling asleep, and in the dream, her soul is able to ascend to a place where it is able to see from a bird's eye view the totality of human and divine knowledge. And of course, it is it's dream, so it's not real, and it's very deceptive, I guess. And that she goes back, her soul, her dreaming soul goes back to her body, and then she awakens, and she realizes that this attainment of total knowledge was only a dream, But however, it does exist, and it's out there. In a way, even though, as I say, she never really walked in the way that we are walking, she is very informed by the Peripatetic school of Athens, formulated by Aristotle, of course. Sor Juana was quite knowledgeable on Aristotle, and he was very influential on her ideas about knowledge. She, at the same time, had a feminist perspective, very early feminist perspective on Aristotle, criticizing him for not having immediate knowledge or actual knowledge about certain things, like being a woman. She once wrote, if Aristotle had cooked, he would have written very differently. But my point here is that Sor Juana was a philosophical wanderer who believed in the Aristotelian approach to knowledge, but at the same time reflected on how knowledge is limited by one's situation. In Aristotle's situation, his inability to see the world through the eyes of a woman or gender. In Sor Juana's case, the awareness that there's knowledge elsewhere, but she cannot access it because of her social or cultural condition. And this, of course, is taken from a title from the legendary Swiss curator Harald Seemann, When Attitudes Become Form. So I'm interested in how when pilgrimage becomes form. And I will try to talk about that now. In art, the way walking has been domesticated, if you will, is by turning into an act of spiritual or touristic pilgrimage, as we know, to specific sites. The museums where I worked for many, many years, often are seen and treated as mausoleums. In other words, like they become sanctuaries or altars to works. And the experience of visiting the artwork is kind of like a hybrid of tourism and the spiritual pilgrimage that I just earlier discussed. A useful way to think about this has been given to us by a sociologist named Jean Falk, It's an American sociologist who has studied the typology of the museum visitor, and he includes different types of people that go to museums. People who work there, people who are professionals, people who only want an experience. But he also has this particular typology of the explorers, people who simply want to like explore around and be around. So there's some movement, of course, is very important in that typology. So artworks in museums often undergo type of double consecration. First, they become commodities that circulate around systems of value until they are enshrined as priceless treasures by museums, right? Then, once they are housed by those institutions and ostensibly by canonical institutions that tell, let's say, the history of modern or contemporary art, they kind of acquire the aura of relics, meaning objects to which we make pilgrimages. So to stand before the Mona Lisa is in a way perhaps less an act of aesthetic contemplation, um, and maybe more like a ritualized performance. Like you're waiting in line, you're trying to get a glimpse, trying to get a selfie in. Walter Benjamin would say the museum that amplifies the aura by staging artworks as sacred, like images. And Carol Duncan, who's another writer who's written extensively about museums, she has argued that this visit itself becomes some kind of like civilizing ritual. And this is the Rothko Chapel in Houston that kind of has that characteristic of like merging this idea of the sacred and the canonical space, both in the artistic and spiritual sense. So Guy Debord, that I'm sure you all have been speaking about today, for him, this ritual is very commodified, right? Tourism, ticket sales, and the circulation of selfies transformed the reverence into revenue. The museum pilgrimage becomes indistinguishable from a consumer experience, and the sacred encounter is packaged as a leisure. In this cycle of idolatry and fetishism, that's where post-minimalist process-based art emerges in the 1960s. So, for example, Alan Capro, in his Happenings, shifted attention away from the object and toward the event. Performance art makes the body itself the medium. Land artists inscribe gestures into the landscape rather than onto canvas. So what matters is not the relic, but the art, the lived moment of participation, of risk, of movement. And Capro himself at some point said, quote, any avant-garde art is primarily a philosophical quest and the finding of truths rather than purely an aesthetic activity. In other words, it's kind of like a form of being, a form of living, you know? And that this is a beautiful piece by Capro, actually made much later in the late 80s, that was titled Taking a Shoe for a Walk. But anyway, walking as an art form, as I think we know, crystallizes this ethos. This piece by Richard Long, titled A Line Made by Walking from 1967, turns the most ordinary of actions into a sculptural trace, reimagining the artwork as a fleeting imprint on the landscape. And I just want to talk about a few artists that I find inspiring, and I believe many of you might as well, that have really influenced this sort of ethos, as I mentioned. Hamish Fulton, who has built an entire practice on the motto of no walk, no work, treating walking itself as both a medium and a message where the journey is the art. And the art is kind of elusive because it resists this commodification of being shown in a museum. And the artist himself, I think, is also a little elusive, hard to actually presenting a challenge of how this work can be presented. Maybe it's impresentable, maybe it's only experiential. Oh, Francis Alice, the Belgian artist who lives in Mexico and who has made many works that are about walking, such as The Collector from 1981, or this very famous piece from 2004, The Green Line, that he did in Jerusalem, right along the line of the Jewish and Palestinian border. where he extends walking into a poetic and political register, where the act of moving through urban space becomes a way of narrating both history and conflict. So, unlike this pilgrimage to the museum as a shrine, these works propose a pilgrimage, but without an object. So, it's not a journey toward any sort of sacred relic, but it's a kind of like a journey towards yourself. To walk as art is to recognize that the sacred lines lies not in commodities, but in the embodied act of moving through the world, where every step is both process and reflection, both artwork and awakening. One of my favorite artists is Stanley Brown. He's going to receive a retrospective. He passed away many years ago, but he's going to get a retrospective at the TIA Foundation here in New York, I think next year. He was a very elusive artist, conceptual artist who was associated with Fluxus, and he was also from Suriname, from Dutch Guyana, actually, and it's just like really interesting. He had this piece titled This Way Brown, where he would ask people for directions as he will stop people in the street and ask them to like draw him a map of where to go to a particular location, and then he will collect the drawings that people would make for him about where to go as the artwork. So this became a series titled This Way Brown, where that are essentially drawn by the hands of strangers, kind of giving him directions of how to get to a particular place that he was asking them about. Really beautiful piece. There's the walking as the fulfillment of the completion of a spiritual or personal relationship. This is the famous piece by Marina Abramovich and Ulay when they decided to break up in 1988, and they decided they're going to walk the whole length of the Chinese, the Great Wall of China, and that once we finally they meet at the point of intersection of the two, that's the moment where their relationship ends. Or the walks by Janet Cardiff, which are audio walks that become very intimate conversations where you hear the voice of the artist directing you to go to different places and pay attention to different things, whether it's the forest or sometimes museums or other spaces. So it's kind of like a kind of way of directing and anchoring the presence. And this is the place also where the work that I feel my generation does, socially engaged art, intersects with artists walking. There's many examples. I won't have time to deal with all of them today because we don't have enough time. I just want to mention Harold Fletcher, who is well known in that field, and a lot of his work is really about the experiential aspect of walking, and also the social aspect of it, the communal aspect of going through the landscape with other people. That becomes really central, I think, to socially engaged art, of course. And now I want to talk a little bit about my relationship to walking in the context of an institution or perhaps the institutional critique, because as mentioned before, I worked for 29 years in different museums as a museum educator. And the goal of education departments and museums is, of course, to help people appreciate and mediate art to audiences. But the great limitation that museums have is that they cannot move, right? They cannot walk anywhere. There's, of course, examples of ambulatory museums that are limited. But mainly what I was interested in was in really exploring audience interaction through movement. And I wanted to see how I could create an institution that actually did move in a very active way, using public programming and audience engagement to do so. So I will just very briefly describe two projects that I did over the course of my career that are not literally about walking per se, but they involve physical activity and physical journeys, where the physical and personal encounters are really critical. as the project becomes defined by those encounters. The School of Pan-American Unrest is a project that I did in 2006, and consisted in me driving from Anchorage to Ushuaia, which is like the entire length of the Pan American Highway, which is the longest highway in the world. It connects most of the countries in the Americas, and it's around 20,000 miles. My desire was to ask, hold workshops and conversations in different cities where I would ask people about what it meant to be American in the largest sense of the word, not American in terms of the United States, but American as an inhabitant of the American hemisphere. I wanted to do so by carrying this very large schoolhouse, which is kind of like a tent that contained or symbolized this institution. And it was for me important to demarcate physically the institution that came with me to have those conversations. At each location, we would set up the tent, have conversations, do workshops, do a collective writing exercise and a presentation and a ceremony that will connect us to other sites. The encounters that went on really varied drastically from meeting lots of people to individuals and having very intimate conversations, such as the first one, which was with Mary Smith Jones, the last speaker of the EAC language in Anchorage. It was a project that really explored the poetry of the road trip, that in the Americas is very much connected to both the spiritual quests, explorers, also the conquistadors, but also of poets like the beat poets, or even the revolutionaries like the Che Guevara, going through his motorcycle through South America. At each location, we would ask local artists and activists to write a speech that will be shared with people who were following the project. And this project, by the way, was created before the era of social media, or before social media was really in full was fully embraced by the mainstream. In 2006, when I finished the project, Twitter had not yet launched, or launched like a week after I finished the project. It also was my first reflection of how an idea can evolve drastically depending on where it goes, where questions of identity, politics, borders change dramatically depending on where you are. So when we speak about migration in a place like Arizona, it actually has a completely different meaning once you are in Mexico or Guatemala or somewhere in South America. The normal constraints and definitions of what we normally utilize within the context of the art world change dramatically depending on where you are. Where in places where there's no art world, where there's no museums, where there's no artistic infrastructure, and that was to me a very important learning from the project, that depending on where you were, the questions that you asked will change. The conversation will be dramatically different. So, and lastly, last but not least, the realization or awareness that I developed, that how meaningful some encounters were in places of scarcity, places where, like here in Asunción in Paraguay, where very few artists from the outside will come to present their projects. The eagerness and desire to connect was enormous. Very different to the big capitals where so much is going on already that it is not possible to really have very meaningful encounters. And the project ended in Puerto Williams in Chile, which is the southernmost part of the world. After that, you have the Antarctica. And in the last house of the end of the road of the last street in Puerto Williams, which is an island. There was Cristina Calderon, who was the last speaker of Yagan, which is a language spoken by the natives of Tierra del Fuego. So anyway, it was a project where the large scale and the small scale encounter went hand in hand, but it was really about understanding space, understanding place by coming to it. The second project I will mention is titled Librería Donceles, and it really is very different in many ways because it only operates within the United States, but it also has this nomadic ethos to it that still continues to this day. As mentioned, I am from Mexico City. I grew up there. And when you go downtown Mexico City, you would encounter in the historic center of the city, which is the site also of the old Tenochtitlan. It's like the old Mexica capital of Mexico. They're very old buildings that contain usually very different businesses. Each street is dedicated to a kind of business. So there's a street for wedding gowns. There's a street for computers. There's a street for I don't know, school supplies. There's a street dedicated to books, which is titled Donceles. And in that you go to it's a street for used bookstores. And you go there. I would go there as a teenager to look for books, and I didn't have any money, but I would get lost in these like incredible forests of books, and then find something for very cheap that will be an interesting book for me. It was a quest for knowledge. It was an exploration to me to be able to go downtown and then find getting knowledge kind of as in a fishing expedition, which was to me really important. So that there's like a lot of traveling and knowledge there. Many years later, I was in New York, and I wanted to. I was seeing how the brick and mortar bookstores were dying, and I wanted to. Also, I was seeing how there was a great scarcity of books in Spanish, in spite of the fact that there's 2 million Latino immigrants in New York City. So I wanted to recreate something that happened in the 1920s by a Mexican poet, a bookstore of books in Spanish. And I went to Mexico City to see if I could get donations of books in exchange of my collages. At first it was very difficult to get donors, but then I had the opposite problem that after a newspaper wrote about my project, everybody wanted to give me books. And I ended up with 20,000 volumes that I was able to fundraise to bring to New York and open the only Spanish language used bookstore in New York. The bookstore was designed kind of in a very intuitive way, but I realized later that I was kind of recreating my childhood home, me being basically the last analog generation, where knowledge to me was the dialogue with these books, and not the internet. That this was my internet basically, and I also saw this bookstore as a third place, a third space, which is essentially a sociological term for a place that is not home, that is not work, but somewhere in between. That's not structured enough that makes you that's like an office, but it's also not unstructured. That it's like the place where you go to sleep. It's a place where you socialize and where you find people with similar interests than yours. What started happening with this project, which was really very community oriented for people who wanted to share their work and have book clubs and conversations, was that many other cities wanted the project. And this was not in the plan originally, but we brought it to the places who wanted us. And one of the first cities was Phoenix, Arizona, where we presented the bookstore, a place where there's a lot of tensions with immigration. It was very beautiful to be able to show a bookstore of Spanish language books in a place like that. So it just continued traveling. This is in San Francisco, for example, to various places and contexts where the books are sold on a pay-by-your-wish basis, but all the proceeds are given to local or arts organizations or organizations that support Latino rights or immigrant rights. The project still continues to till today, and I'm surprised, after more than 10 years later, we're still in operation. But the most important thing is how the project has become this nomadic learning experience. Now I want to talk about the subject of being lost or getting lost, and which is like the last part of my presentation. The term niño perdido is actually something it's a term I really love because it's kind of a poetic and weird name. It was the name of a street in Mexico in the 1950s. It's still the area is still called Niño Perdido, like lost boy, because apparently in the 1950s or before that time, in the 19th century, in this area, a boy got lost. And interestingly, we don't really know who that boy was or whether it was true or even not true. The anecdote itself has been lost, so we don't even know where the hell that initial anecdote comes from. But I always loved the term niño perdido. My point here, I know we'll make it later, has to do with like the nature of displacement and relationship with art. I think a lot about the project by Bushra Khalili, who's a Moroccan artist who did a project called the Mapping Journey Project. It's a series of videos that details the stories of various individuals who, for political and economic circumstances, they have been traveling illegally through the Mediterranean basin. She interviews people who have traveled through Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and then she asks each person to narrate their journey and use a marker to trace their journeys on a map. So it's so you never see the faces of the people being interviewed, but you see their hands drawing the maps of where they have been. So displacement, whether it's intentional or accidental, happens to be, I think, very deeply generative. When we are a place, we see differently. The city rearranges itself. Our assumptions are unsettled. Suddenly, a side street, a fragment of a conversation, a cafe, can become a conversation. And to me, this has always been very central because walking, to me, is not about efficiency, but about discovery. And I think many of you might agree with that. To be displaced is to be invited into new ways of perceiving, to reframe perspective and re-examine reality. So it is in those moments of disorientation that the real work of art and the work of learning emerges. So walking also means accept disorientation. The situationists call this the dérive, the drifting through the city without purpose, letting chance and atmosphere guide the way. Psychogeography teaches us that getting lost is not a mistake, but a method. Displacement, whether by design or accident, is productive because it unsettles our habits, shifts our perspective, and opens us to what we would otherwise overlook. So to walk, to learn, to even lose our way, these are not detours from art, but the very conditions of it. In displacement, we reframe reality. In drifting, we encounter the world anew. And for the artist, being lost is not a failure. It is a condition. To be dislocated, to stand on the margins, is to step into the role of the outsider. Walking is our most direct instrument for this task. The line we draw across the world to register what we are and who we are becoming. Each step is a cartography of reality, a way of sketching our fragile bonds with place and time. And this, in this unease of this dislocation, this vertigo of not quite belonging, is where some of the most meaningful artworks are made. For to be out of place is also to see differently, to sense more sharply, to discover what the familiar conceals. Walking teaches us that the shrine is not ahead of us, waiting in a temple or a museum. The shrine is the path itself. The movement, the detour, the drift is the moment of being lost and the act of finding anew. So ultimately, displacement as survival, as pilgrimage, as knowledge, offers us a model of thinking about pedagogy and art. Walking, movement, and dialogue are not marginal activities. They are central to how we learn, how we transmit knowledge, and how we experience art. And the peripatetic tradition, from Aristotle to Johanna, from psychogeography to contemporary art, reminds us that learning and creating are acts in motion. And I want to close with this one last but important note. You might be familiar with Maurice Maeterlinck, the Belgian writer's play, The Blue Bird. It's a symbolist play from the turn of the century. It's about two children that they set out on a long journey toward happiness. They travel through strange lands, memory, nights, the future itself. And when they all return, after all wandering in search of that blue bird, they realize that the blue bird was at home the whole time. So I feel that walking too is a similar quest. We walk not just to get somewhere, but to lose ourselves, to dislocate ourselves, to get the world rearranged before our eyes. And yet, at the end, what we discover is not some distant treasure, it is the nearness of what was already there. The lesson of the blue bird is not that the journey was unnecessary, it is that the journey was the only way to truly see what home represents. To walk is to go outward in order to return inward. To walk is to trace step by step the cartography of belonging. So when we walk, we too are looking for that bird of happiness. And if we are lucky, if we are attentive, we might find it waiting for us, perched quietly where it has always been, at home. And Johannes asked me to make an cartoon about this topic, and there you have it. Thank you so much. Oh,
Pablo, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you
Yes.
so much. I guess there are questions. I look back here. And any questions from Pablo? And are there questions also online? No? Big, I, I think I can't hear him.
I cannot hear the question. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Right,
I'm so can you hear this?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to take a moment before I have a question. I just wanted to say it was an absolutely stunning lecture, extremely moving, extremely beautiful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I also not formulated a question yet, but just more of like a response. I think I'm so moved by your how you talk about like the pilgrimage and then the artwork that is worked on the immigrants, the routes that immigrants did, and then also you ending with the bluebird. And I just think about one quote by Caesar, the architect, about there's a sketch that and then he wrote exile is homecoming, and I think it's kind of like echo quite somehow echo with your presentation today. Yeah, but thank you. I was also very moved. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pablo. That's been such a pleasure to listen to your words, and we learned so much. Just amazing, speechless. But I have a question for you. Well, first one is a comment, perhaps on the way how you presented, traditional works in museums as kind of fetishistic and perhaps idolatory. And I was thinking whether, after what we read about, I don't know, the infrastructures of museums, and you worked so long time for MoMA as well, I'm thinking about this book by not Jorge Otero Palos, his name is Dominguez Rubio, about the infrastructures of the museum, especially in MoMA, how things actually move, how we can talk also about traditional works, as kind of, in a way, non-human entities that walk around and move around in those infrastructures, ascend around the world, and even Mona Lisa. I mean, there have been some place this kind of a scholar who calculated, how much effort and time it takes to for those works to be kind of sent around. But my question is of another nature. I wonder whether you have experience with the walking in museums, in institutions, or perhaps outside by people who are differently abled. So where walking might mean something else. I don't know if you could comment on this a little.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I guess the one thing I did not really touch on very much was the whole idea of walking within museums, which is a whole topic, the importance really of movements within the institution, and also how that is presents challenges of access for those who are differently abled. So questions of access are really central to this, right? And that's why access is so important for museums, how you can make it wheelchair accessible and have other kind of accessibility aspects to it. As an educator in museums for many years, we thought a lot about these issues, and within the confines of what we had to work with, we always at least I always try to think a lot about how we could use space in spatial poetics, perhaps, to improve the viewing experience. And in the case of MoMA, for example, one thing that I really loved using is attempts was a sculpture garden, which is, for those of you who are familiar with MoMA, it has this very beautiful central courtyard that has sculptures in it. And there's something really peaceful about it, that it's very different from like the kind of hectic aspect of the galleries where there's a lot of people walking back and forth. In the garden, that you have like a fountain and you have sculptures and there's people sitting around more relaxed. And I felt that was more conducive for conversation. So I always felt it was a great place to be, So you work within the confines of what you're given, right? Just like as we worked with during the pandemic with the confines we were given. The museums are indeed spaces that can be used and activated. What I think does not work, or where I think it's difficult, is when you actually create a very rigid structure where you have to stand for hours in front of a painting listening to somebody talk. I think that's very, very inhuman. It's not actually easy or a good approach pedagogically or experientially, for that matter. So I think it's a question of really what you have to work with. What is it, the space that you have to work with? And you can use elements of choreography, of theater, or the performing arts, of many other things to really create a sense of activation. And I do believe that movement is really crucial for learning. And that's at every age, and I think we need to like exploit that and make the best of that of what the conditions that we're given, special conditions that we're given to create a meaningful experience, whether it's a museum or outside the museum.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, 2 more questions here.
Just a brief question. Thank you very much for this presentation. You mentioned pilgrimages in the beginning, and what I'm wondering for is you mentioned Luis Buñuel. Luis Buñuel named the the way to Santiago de Compostela as Via Lactea, the Milky Way, in the sense that the way, the walking, the way through is full of stars. It's a nocturne, a night walking, and Compostela, Compostelle, the name of Santiago. And what else came in mind is really what could be the significance of a new form of pilgrimages, because these pilgrimages created also a place, created a narrative for a long time, and is getting lost. So pilgrimages today in an atheistic society have no anymore this function. Of course, is known pilgrimages, but what could be a pilgrimage today in a new form?
It's a great question. And, let me say another thing about Buñuel, which is interesting. Buñuel was strongly anti-religious and anti-clerical. He hated the church, and he made a lot of films. He made that very clear, a lot of his films, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that the journey itself of the journey to Santiago it is for many a spiritual journey, but it is even today, a really beautiful and personal experience for everybody that wants to take it. So I think that I think artists try to answer that question that you just formulated in many different ways, and the artistic experience has a spiritual aspect to it. I think it's an equivalent. It has equivalent power of a spiritual experience. But mostly these experiences are about transformation. These journeys, these pilgrimages are, as I try to argue, not so much about the object that you find at the end, but about the process and how you yourself become transformed by them. I feel that the reason why we take on long journeys can be sometimes very personal. Sometimes we're in a moment of crisis. I have had that in my life, moments where I felt kind of lost personally, and then undertakes a very big journey, which becomes transformative. And I think we see that in folk tales. It's a very common, I guess, narrative model. Like the hero goes into these long quests to find something or to understand something, and whether they find it or do not find it is kind of like, in a way, separate from the fact that they have transformed themselves, that there's like a transformative process, And I think that's what drives us as artists. I think it's really not so much like we are kind of in search of the gold rush. We're like, we're gonna get gold, find gold at the end of the rainbow, but we are driven by the quest itself. There's something very fulfilling about it, and at least that's how I see it. And and the other thing is that you don't really know what you're going to find about yourself and about the world as you undertake the journey, which is it's very exciting as well. Like I guess as an educator, I think about that all the time. Like I'm excited about what the things that I don't know I'm going to find.
Wonderful. We can take one or two more questions, and then we have to wrap up for Tim. So there's one. Yeah, sure.
I'm a landscape architect and urban designer, originally from Chicago, working here. And I use the principle of drifting a lot in a lot of my projects in many, many contexts. Because of that, the state that you were describing, it was really nice to hear you talk about it. And my question is, I guess I've had a fantasy since I'm quite young professional of integrating this kind of thoughts into kind of a city planning or urbanism, to have a dialogue with the cities, like with my hometown Chicago or wherever, and talk about what it means to walk in a city. And New York is, of course, predestined for that. And I'm just curious if you've had any contact to urbanists or people working on creating the built environment we live in every day, and any contact with people who actually talk about giving this a value in the everyday lives of all the people, and not just kind of this beautiful experiences that certain people speak about in poetry or art.
Thanks for the question. By the way, I went to school in Chicago, and it's a very meaningful place to me. It's an amazing place. Yes, I think it's a very important topic, and I'm not sure how to best addressed. I think about the architectural tours that, in a very basic way, that happen in places in Chicago and elsewhere, that help you rediscover the city. And even though these are like very kind of like basic models, I wish there were more of those all the time, because I'm interested not so much in the traditional kind of tourist tours, that take you to the landmarks. I'm interested in the underground tours, the tours that reveal to you the hidden city, the things that no one ever talks about, or the hidden places, the unseen city. I think that embracing the search for the unseen can be really powerful. And a place like Chicago and many other any city for that matter has, let's say, an official history, like the outside, the big landmarks, the museums, the tourist sites and whatever, or the commercial hubs. But then there's also the underground city, which is way more interesting and more perhaps hidden because people don't want to see it, or they want to recognize certain histories about it. And the fact that it's hidden makes it even more revealing, once you find it. So I don't know, perhaps that's maybe the direction I will go to in trying to explore that question. But
Thank you, Pablo. Just to wrap it up, since we are here in also conferences linked to the 100-year anniversary of Lucius Burckhardt, just close it up. Were you familiar with Lucius' work and stolology or the promenadology? And if so, do you see any connection to your work and socially engaged work?
I should confess that I did not know his work until you invited me to this conference, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to it in my ignorance. Um, but yes, I feel that a lot of the work that we are doing right now, and I think one of the exciting things about making art is that sometimes you don't have the language to explain what you're doing. And I think his work gives us a really wonderful set of terms and words to use to find definitions for that, and I think that I really welcome like this conference, and I look forward to what you guys will discuss to help create better articulation of how these terms can be applied to the artistic practice.
Yes, we work on that, and we can continue the legacy and the thinking of Lucius Burckhardt with this conference and with your lecture as well. So thank you for that.